Underneath that, there's no oxygen, no life. And down there, we found conchs and conch shells and hermit crabs that had fallen into the hole and suffocated.
Have you ever looked at the ocean and wondered what could be hiding far beneath that calm, beautiful surface? Off the coast of Belize sits a place that looks almost unreal from above. A giant, nearly perfect blue circle surrounded by the bright turquoise waters of the Caribbean. It's called the Great Blue Hole, and from the surface it looks peaceful. But go deeper, and that peaceful view disappears. As divers and researchers descended, sunlight vanished, fish disappeared, and the reef gave way to darkness. Around 90 meters, they entered a layer where oxygen was gone and hydrogen sulfide had accumulated. Before we go any deeper, hit that like button and subscribe. What researchers discovered at the bottom revealed a story hidden there for thousands of years. At the bottom, shells and remains sat untouched. Beneath them were sediment layers containing evidence of storms dating back 5,700 years. When scientists studied those layers, they noticed a change in the pattern of storms. So, what exactly did they discover? Let's go deeper. A perfect circle that shouldn't exist. To understand why anyone would risk a dive like this, you have to see the place from above first. Off the coast of Belize, roughly 60 miles from shore, the turquoise Caribbean suddenly gives way to a perfect, near-black circle as if someone had taken an ink dropper to a sheet of glass. From an airplane window or a satellite photo, it looks less like a natural feature and more like a hole punched clean through the sea floor. This is the Great Blue Hole, a massive underwater sinkhole stretching more than 300 meters across and plunging over 400 feet straight down. It sits inside Lighthouse Reef, part of the larger Belize Barrier Reef system, one of the most biologically rich stretches of ocean on Earth. And yet right in the middle of all that color and life, this one perfect circle sits like a wound that never healed, dark enough that the eye reads it as depth before the brain even processes why. Geologists believe formations like this begin life as dry limestone caves carved out over tens of thousands of years during past ice ages when sea levels were dramatically lower. As the ice melted and the oceans rose, those cave systems flooded and eventually collapsed in on themselves, leaving behind a nearly circular sinkhole with walls that plunge almost straight down. It's a process that unfolds over an almost incomprehensible span of time, and the result is a formation so symmetrical that early observers struggled to believe it wasn't shaped by something other than nature. Boats anchor at its edge, and snorkelers drift along the rim, staring down into water so dark it seems to swallow the sunlight a few meters below the surface. From the surface, it's simply striking. What almost nobody grasps, standing on a boat deck, is that the transition from shallow reef to bottomless dark happens within just a few strokes of a fin. The place had a reputation long before any modern expedition arrived. In the 1970s, the pioneering ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau brought his research vessel here and called it one of the greatest diving spots on the planet. His footage helped turn a remote sinkhole into a global icon, decades before anyone had the technology to properly study what was actually happening at the bottom of it. For most people, that's where the story ends. A gorgeous photo, a bucket list dive spot, a postcard from Belize. But the deeper truth of this place had almost nothing to do with how it looked from the surface. Segment 3. A mission built on a hunch. In 2018, a serious scientific expedition set out to do something no one had fully managed before: map the entire floor of the blue hole and figure out exactly what was happening in its lowest, darkest reaches. This wasn't a group of thrill-seekers with GoPros. It was a coordinated operation involving specialized submersibles, professional marine researchers, and enough funding and planning to suggest everyone involved took the risk extremely seriously. Names attached to the project included entrepreneur Richard Branson and ocean explorer Fabien Cousteau, continuing his grandfather's connection to the site decades later. Their goal wasn't just a dramatic descent for cameras, it was a full scientific survey, sonar mapping of the sinkholes' contours, sediment sampling from the floor, and detailed chemical readings of the water at every depth along the way. And here's the detail that made the whole mission feel less like tourism and more like an investigation. Earlier sonar scans had already picked up something unusual near the bottom, a strange, flat, almost sealed-looking layer, sitting like a lid across part of the hole. Whatever it was, it hinted that oxygen levels down there might be close to nothing at all. In other words, the team wasn't diving in blind, hoping to be surprised. They were diving in with a working theory that something down there behaved differently from the rest of the ocean, and they wanted proof. Segment 4. The moment the ocean changes. The first stretch of the descent feels almost ordinary. Sunlight filters down in fading blue shafts. Small fish drift past the viewport, curious about the intrusion, circling the strange metal shape moving slowly through their world. It still feels like the ocean everyone knows, just dimmer, quieter, a little colder with every passing meter. Then, at roughly 90 meters, everything shifts at once. It isn't gradual. Divers and submersible pilots involved in the expedition described it less like a slow transition and more like hitting an invisible wall. The color drains out of the water almost instantly. The light that had been filtering down disappears, replaced by a strange, hazy thickness, as though the water itself has changed texture, gone from something you swim through to something you have to push against. Movement outside the vehicle slows to nothing. The fish are gone. The reef textures on the walls of the sinkhole vanish into a uniform, featureless dark. What they had entered is known as a hydrogen sulfide layer, a dense band of water where the chemistry changes so completely that oxygen essentially vanishes. Above this line, the blue hole is still recognizably part of the living ocean. Below it, almost nothing that needs to breathe can survive, and the water itself begins to behave more like a chemical solution than a habitat. Crew members who documented the moment compared it to sealing themselves inside a room that happens to be built out of ocean water, a chamber miles wide with an invisible ceiling holding everything above it out. It's the kind of boundary you can't see coming until you're already inside it, and once you are, there's no mistaking that you've crossed into somewhere fundamentally different. Segment 5. Crossing into the dead zone. Once the submersibles pushed through that toxic layer, the team expected the seafloor to look at least somewhat familiar. What they found instead was silence in its most literal, physical form. No darting fish, no crabs scuttling across the sediment, no scavengers picking through the remains of anything that had died. Just stillness, broken only by scattered mollusk shells, lying exactly where their owners had perished, some of them apparently intact for what could be centuries. Conch shells rested undisturbed on the slope, and here and there the remains of hermit crabs sat exactly where they had fallen, having wandered too far down and simply run out of oxygen before they could climb back out. There was nothing left to disturb them. In a normal marine environment, dead organisms are broken down quickly, consumed, scattered, recycled back into the ecosystem within days or weeks. Down here, with oxygen essentially absent, that entire process simply doesn't happen. Whatever settles to the bottom of this chamber tends to stay exactly where it lands, sometimes for so long that it becomes less a corpse and more a fixture, part of the geology of the place, rather than a remnant of anything that was once alive. Scientists describe this kind of environment as anoxic, meaning oxygen-starved, to the point that ordinary biological activity grinds to a halt. Organic material drifting down from the healthy waters above gets trapped in this stagnant zone, slowly decomposing and releasing exactly the kind of toxic gas that created the barrier in the first place. No currents flow through to flush it out. No fresh oxygen mixes in from above. The result is a closed chemical system that has likely been quietly stabilizing itself layer by layer for centuries, sealed off almost like a chamber that decided long ago to stop taking part in the rest of the ocean's usual rhythms. Segment 6. Strange shapes on the ocean floor. As the cameras swept across the sediment, they picked up features that made even seasoned researchers pause. Odd mineral crusts had formed in rippling, almost sculptural patterns across parts of the floor, unlike anything commonly seen at shallower depths. Even stranger were long, thin tracks etched into the soft sediment, the kind of marks you'd expect something to leave behind while dragging across the bottom. Except nothing living down there seemed capable of making them. In an environment this hostile to life, identifying a plausible source for those tracks became its own small mystery. Elsewhere in the sediment, the team documented debris that clearly hadn't formed naturally, fragments and materials that had likely drifted down from the surface world over decades, carried by storms and currents until they finally settled somewhere they'd never leave. Some expedition summaries also referenced the presence of human remains recovered from the broader blue hole system during earlier dives, remains so thoroughly integrated into the sediment over time that they had effectively become part of the site's geological record rather than anything resembling a recent event. Put it all together, and a picture starts to form that's genuinely unsettling. This isn't an empty void at the bottom of a pretty sinkhole. It's closer to a sealed vault. Whatever goes in, stays in. Nothing down here really leaves. Segment 7. A vault that keeps perfect records. That idea is worth sitting with for a second, because it reframes everything that came before it. A dead, oxygen-starved chamber sounds like a horror story, and on the surface, it plays like one. But an environment that never disturbs what settles into it isn't just eerie. It's also, by definition, an extraordinarily good place to store information. If nothing down there decomposes quickly, if nothing gets stirred up by currents or scavengers, then every single thing that has ever sunk into this chamber is still arranged, more or less, the way it fell. Which raises an obvious question the expedition couldn't ignore. If this place has been quietly preserving everything that enters it for centuries, what exactly has it been recording all this time? The answer to that question turned out to be far bigger than anyone expected. Segment 8. The core that changed the story. The real breakthrough of the expedition didn't come from a dramatic sighting or a shocking visual. It came from something almost boring to look at. A long, narrow cylinder of mud, roughly 30 meters in length, carefully extracted from the floor of the blue hole and brought back to the surface for analysis. According to research findings published in 2025, that unassuming tube of sediment turned out to be one of the most detailed natural storm records ever recovered anywhere in the Caribbean. Packed inside it were distinct bands, layer after layer, each one representing a separate depositional event stretching back an estimated 5,700 years. Here's the mechanism behind it. Every major storm that passes over this part of the ocean churns up sediment, stirs debris from the surrounding reef, and dumps a fresh layer of material into the sinkhole below. Once it settles into that oxygen-starved chamber, it isn't disturbed again. It just gets buried under the next layer, and the next, like pages stacking up in a book nobody has opened in thousands of years. Nature didn't need complicated instruments to keep this record. It just needed time, stillness, and a chamber sealed off from everything that would normally erase it. Segment 9. A pattern hidden in the mud. When researchers began comparing the oldest layers deep in the core to the more recent ones closer to the surface, a pattern emerged that was hard to dismiss as coincidence. For most of that 5,700-year record, storm layers appeared relatively spaced out, consistent with a handful of major cyclone events every century. It was, by all appearances, a stable, slow rhythm that held steady for thousands of years. Then, moving up through the core into more recent centuries, that spacing starts to collapse. The layers stack closer together. Storm signatures that used to be separated by decades or more start showing up in tighter and tighter succession. According to analysis of the findings, this points to a significant increase in tropical cyclone activity in this part of the Caribbean, concentrated overwhelmingly in the last few hundred years. This is the moment the story stops being about a strange dive and starts being about something with real consequences. A chamber that had spent millennia recording nature's slow, steady tempo was now showing that tempo's speeding up. Segment 10. Why the acceleration matters. It's tempting to treat a detail like this as an abstract scientific footnote, but the practical implications are anything but abstract. A storm record that shows major events spaced far apart over centuries describes a very different world than one where those events start clustering closer together. Fewer years between major storms means less time for coastlines, ecosystems, and communities to recover before the next one arrives. It means infrastructure built to withstand once-in-a-generation damage may suddenly be facing that level of stress far more often. It means agriculture, fresh water supplies, and even long-term population patterns in vulnerable coastal regions come under pressure that simply didn't exist during the calmer stretches of this record. And unlike a model or a prediction, this data doesn't rely on assumptions about the future. It's a physical record of what has already happened, sealed away in mud that had no reason to lie, exaggerate, or leave anything out. When researchers cross-reference the upper layers of the core against modern hurricane tracking data, the recent spike wasn't subtle. It looked less like ordinary variation inside a stable system, and more like a genuine shift away from a baseline that had held for thousands of years. Segment 11. The climax, a warning with no alarm bells. Here's the part that hits hardest once it settles in. The blue hole was never trying to warn anyone about anything. It doesn't theorize. It doesn't model the future. It just quietly recorded whatever happened, storm by storm, century by century, without a shred of interpretation or opinion attached. And that's exactly what makes it so unsettling. This isn't a scientist's projection, built on assumptions that might be wrong. It's physical, layered, dated evidence sitting at the bottom of a sinkhole that has been keeping this record since long before written history in the region even began. When evidence like that shows an unmistakable acceleration in recent centuries, it becomes very difficult to write off as noise. It raises an uncomfortable question about how societies plan for the future, especially in regions like the Caribbean, where coastlines already sit close to the edge of storm exposure. We tend to treat natural history as background trivia, interesting but distant from anything urgent. But what happens when that history turns out to be a mirror held up to exactly the kind of risk we're living inside of right now, already reflecting a change that's been building for longer than anyone realized? Segment 12. What the Internet got wrong. If you search for coverage of this expedition, you'll notice something almost immediately. Most of it leans hard into the eerie visuals, mysterious tracks in the sediment, a dead zone straight out of a horror movie, headlines built to make you stop scrolling, rather than to explain what any of it actually means. That framing isn't exactly false. The bottom of the blue hole really is a lightless, oxygen-starved chamber littered with undisturbed remains, and that's a genuinely striking thing to see on camera. But treating that as the whole story misses almost everything that matters about it. The deeper research, the sediment chemistry, the storm layer analysis, the 5,000+ years of climate data quietly sitting in that mud core, rarely gets the same attention. It doesn't produce a jump-scare thumbnail. It requires patience, some basic understanding of sediment science, and a willingness to sit with a slow-building idea instead of an instant shock. A chemically complex anoxic sinkhole that's been recording climate history since before the pyramids were built gets compressed online into a spooky 10-second clip. And in that compression, the part of the story that could actually change how we think about coastal risk and climate history gets quietly left behind. Segment 13. The archive beneath the surface, which brings the story back to that perfect blue circle, the one visible from an airplane window, the one that made this place famous decades before anyone understood what was underneath it. It's easy to look at an image like that and see nothing but scenery, something photogenic, something to check off a travel list. But scenery was never really what this place was. Underneath that beautiful surface sits a sealed, silent chamber that has spent close to 6,000 years keeping an honest, uninterrupted record of every major storm to pass through this stretch of ocean. And that record is now showing a pace of change unlike anything in its own deep history. Nature didn't need to raise its voice to leave that warning behind. It just needed somewhere undisturbed enough to keep the record intact and enough time for someone, eventually, to come along and read it properly. So maybe the real question isn't what the blue hole recorded in the past. It's how many other quiet places on this planet are holding on to records just like it, sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to notice. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you as much as it does us, let us know what you think is still waiting to be discovered in the comments, and subscribe for the next deep dive into the places our planet has been quietly recording all along. Segment 14. Reading the layers, one by one. The most important part of this discovery is easy to miss, because there is no single dramatic object to point at. The evidence is spread across thousands of years of sediment, compressed into layers so thin that the story only becomes visible when researchers stop looking at the bottom as a single place and start treating it as a sequence of events. Think about what that means. The surface of the Caribbean changes constantly. Waves move sand. Currents carry particles away. Animals disturb the seafloor. Storms tear material from reefs and redistribute it. In most marine environments, those processes make it difficult to preserve a clean record of exactly what happened and when. But inside this particular sinkhole, the conditions are radically different. The water below the hydrogen sulfide boundary is stagnant and oxygen-starved. Material that falls into it can settle without being repeatedly mixed through the water column. One layer can remain beneath another, and another beneath that, preserving a sequence that would normally be broken apart or erased. The result is not a photograph of a storm. It is something more useful to researchers, a physical timeline. Each layer becomes a clue. Its thickness, composition, and position can be compared with the layers around it. When a storm produces an unusually strong signal, that signal can stand out from the quieter material deposited during ordinary periods. Over thousands of years, those individual signals accumulate into a record that can be examined from the oldest material upward toward the present. That is why the sediment core matters so much. The core is not valuable because it looks extraordinary. It is valuable because it connects separate moments in time. A storm that happened thousands of years ago is no longer just a possibility suggested by a model or a story preserved in human memory. Its trace can remain physically embedded in the mud, and once those traces are arranged in order, researchers can begin asking questions that would otherwise be almost impossible to answer. How frequently did major storms occur? Were there long, quiet intervals? Did the spacing between major events remain similar over time? Or did the rhythm change? The blue hole provides a rare setting in which those questions can be approached through preserved material rather than through modern observation alone. Segment 15. Why the silence is so valuable. There is an irony at the center of the entire discovery. The same conditions that make the bottom of the blue hole feel hostile are the conditions that make it scientifically valuable. For a diver, oxygen-poor water and hydrogen sulfide are reasons to be extremely cautious. For a sediment record, however, the lack of oxygen changes what happens after material reaches the bottom. Biological activity is reduced, scavenging is limited, and the usual processes that constantly rearrange a marine floor become far less effective. That means the silence down there is not simply an absence of life. It is an absence of disturbance. Imagine dropping a sheet of paper onto a busy street. Cars run over it. People step on it. Wind moves it. Rain damages it. Within a short time, it may be impossible to tell where it originally landed. Now imagine placing the same sheet inside a sealed room where nothing moves. Years later, it would still be lying almost exactly where it was placed. The blue hole is obviously far more complicated than that simple comparison, but the principle helps explain why the sediment record is so important. The less the layers are disturbed after they settle, the more confidently researchers can study their sequence. This also explains why the expedition required more than simply reaching the bottom. Getting a camera into a dark environment can reveal what the environment looks like. Mapping and sampling can reveal something deeper, how that environment has changed through time. A visual image gives you a moment. A core gives you a history. That distinction matters because the most important discovery was not something the expedition team could simply point a camera at and identify in a few seconds. It was a pattern hidden inside material that had accumulated slowly, layer after layer. The frightening part of the blue hole is therefore not necessarily a creature, a hidden structure, or some unexplained object. It is the realization that an ordinary-looking patch of sediment can contain evidence from a world that existed long before modern instruments ever arrived. Segment 16. From ancient storms to modern questions. Once the layers are interpreted as a long-term record, the story becomes much larger than the blue hole itself. For thousands of years, storms left their signatures without anyone watching. There were no satellites tracking them, no modern forecasting centers issuing warnings, and no instruments continuously measuring the atmosphere above the Caribbean. Yet the storms still happened, and some of their physical consequences eventually settled into this underwater chamber. The mud became the archive. That archive does not tell us everything. It cannot explain every individual storm, and it cannot answer every question about why the climate changed at a particular moment. But it can preserve enough information to reveal broad patterns that disappear when we look only at the short period covered by modern records. Modern humans tend to think in relatively short timelines. A few decades can feel enormous within a person's life. Even a century can seem like ancient history. But a 5,700-year sediment record changes that perspective completely. It places recent changes alongside thousands of years of earlier conditions. Suddenly, the word recent means something very different. A shift that appears dramatic when compared with the last few generations can be examined against a much longer baseline. That is one of the reasons natural archives matter so much to climate researchers. They allow modern observations to be placed inside a deeper historical context. And that is what makes the blue hole's storm layers so compelling. The discovery does not depend on turning the sinkhole into a supernatural mystery. The real mystery is already powerful enough. How can a dark chamber beneath a beautiful tropical sea preserve a record of environmental change that humans could never have observed directly? The answer is hidden in the chemistry of the water, the movement of sediment, and the passage of time. None of those things are dramatic by themselves. Together, they create an archive. The record survived because darkness kept it safe.